That blizzard came down like the wrath of heaven. Through a solid white wall of snow, Matthew Hayes saw a dark shape just give out. He'd been out riding his fence line, checking his post before the storm buried everything in this part of the Montana Territory. It was February of 1885. That wind howled like a pack of wounded wolves, just tearing at his old, worn-out cavalry coat, freezing the very breath in his lungs. The temperature was dropping like a stone. The sky was a bruised purple gray, pressing down on the valley like a heavy lid on a pot fixing to boil over. His barometer had dropped faster than he'd seen in years. That was a bad sign. A man caught out in this would freeze solid before he could even count to 500. Matthew had nearly missed that figure, just a dark smudge against all that white. It swayed for a moment, then just folded at the knees. It happened right near his boundary marker, maybe 40 yards out. His good eye squinted against the snow, making sure he saw what he thought he saw. Yep, someone was out there. He didn't hesitate for a second. Couldn't. Hesitating meant a cold grave in a Montana winter. "Come on now, Thunder," he urged his horse forward. The big animal argued for a moment, wanting to head back to the barn, but he answered to the firm squeeze of Matthew's knees. 15 years together meant they understood each other without a word. The wind cut right through his clothes and ice started forming on his beard. Each breath he took was a burning fire, and his right leg throbbed where that Confederate bullet shattered the bone back at Antietam. Old wounds always start singing in the cold, reminding a man of debts paid in his own blood. Matthew got to the fallen person in just a few seconds. It was a woman face down in the snow, one arm stretched out like she was reaching for something that just wasn't there. She had on a fine leather coat, soaked clean through, with her dark hair frozen right to her neck. That was way too fine a coat for these parts. City clothes, Eastern clothes. He swung down from his horse, ignoring the scream of pain from his bad leg. He pulled her up. She was dead weight, but he could feel her breathing, real shallow. Still with us, he thought, but not for long in this cold. "Looks like it wasn't your day to die, ma'am," he muttered, lifting her across his saddle. Not if he had anything to say about it. The storm just swallowed them whole. He couldn't see a thing. Matthew had to find his way by pure instinct and a little bit of faith. He was counting fence posts he couldn't even see, trusting old Thunder to find his way home. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. Another bad sign. The cold would take your fingers and toes first, then your arms and legs, then your life. His mind flashed back to Gettysburg, that awful July of 1863, dragging Lieutenant Collins through all that cannon fire till a cannonball took both his legs clean off. He remembered the same burning in his lungs back then, the same feeling that every single step might be his last one. But he had gotten Collins to the field hospital. The man lived, even went home to his wife in Ohio. Some instincts just never leave a man, and some debts never truly get paid in full. The cabin showed up all of a sudden through the whiteout, a dark little square in all that chaos. Matthew had built it with his own two hands right after the bank took his family's farm. It had a stone foundation with timber walls packed with mud and horsehair. It was small, but it was solid. It would hold up against anything the Montana sky could throw at it. He kicked the door open, carried her right inside, and laid her down near the stone fireplace. Her lips were blue and she was shivering, something awful. Her body was fighting the cold and losing badly. He worked fast, building the fire up high, his own hands shaking from the cold and the hurry. The kindling caught, then the pine logs, and the flames started licking their way up. Then he got her out of that wet coat and her boots, being respectful but moving with desperation. That coat alone was probably worth more than everything he owned. It was fine European wool, lined with real fox fur, and had brass buttons with some kind of family crest on them. The dress she had on underneath was just as fancy, a deep blue silk with fancy stitching. That was a dress for a high society party, not the Montana wilderness. Matthew wrapped her up in his only wool blanket, the one his mother had woven for him before the war. Before everything changed. The woman didn't wake up, she just kept on shivering. He leaned back against the wall, bone-tired, just watching her breathe. Outside, the storm screamed like a banshee. Inside, the fire sent dancing orange light across the rough timber walls. she was alive. For now, that was enough. This land doesn't forgive you for standing still. You either moved or you died. And Matthew had moved. Now all he could do was wait. She woke up to the light of the fire and the smell of coffee. It was bitter, strong, and real. Her eyes opened real slow and she looked all confused. Her whole body ached like she'd been trampled by a herd of cattle. The room slowly came into focus. Just one room made of rough-cut timber with a table and two chairs. The shelves held a few tin plates and not much else, and there was a fireplace crackling warmly. A man was sitting across from her, just watching her quietly. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling down a stream. "Just take it steady. You had a real close call out there." She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her ribs. She gasped. "Careful now," the man said, getting up. He poured her a cup of coffee from a dented old pot and offered her a tin cup. "It ain't much, ma'am, but it's warm." She took it, her hands shaking something awful. The heat felt like life itself seeping back into her. She took a sip. It was terrible. Coffee burnt black as a sinner's soul, strong enough to strip the paint off a barn, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Where am I?" Her voice came out like a rasp. "My place, about 3 miles from Timberline. Storm's still raising a fuss." He gestured to the window. Outside, a white fury was still raging on. "Found you near my fence line. You've been out nearly a full day." "A day?" Her mind was spinning in circles. He just nodded, not pushing her. "Matthew Hayes," he said finally, placing a plate with beans and salt pork on the table. It was simple food. He took half for himself and left half for her. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. If she told him who she really was, everything would change. It always did. "Elizabeth," she said at last. "Just that and nothing more." He nodded, accepting what she offered without asking for more. It was then she noticed the empty shelves, the patched-up roof, the worn-out Bible with no cover sitting by the narrow bed. He was sharing the very little he had. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You would have done the same." Matthew looked away, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Elizabeth wasn't so sure that was true. She had never been tested like that. They ate in silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like two people who had survived something big together. The storm kept howling through the night. Matthew banked the fire and showed her how to keep it steady without wasting a single stick of wood. She noticed his shirt was torn at the shoulder and poorly patched. "Let me," she said, reaching for her saddlebag that he had rescued. She found a needle and thread, small things she always carried. They were tools from a life he knew nothing about. She mended the tear while he tended the fire. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. When she finished, she handed it back to him. Their fingers touched for just a heartbeat. "You did not have to do that." "You saved my life," Elizabeth replied. He looked at her then, really looked, with eyes that had seen too much. One was a clear blue, the other slightly cloudy from an old injury. "I do not know if I would have stopped for a stranger in that storm," she added softly. Something passed between them then, a quiet understanding that neither one of them could name. Elizabeth touched the locket at her throat. It was solid gold, engraved with the Prescott family crest, worth more than this entire cabin. She hid it. She quickly when Matthew glanced over. She was not ready, not yet. Morning finally came with pale light filtering through the single window. Elizabeth woke to find Matthew was already up, stoking the fire, making more of that terrible, wonderful coffee. On the rough shelf beside his bed, she noticed something unexpected. Books. A small collection, worn and well-read. Thoreau's Walden, Emerson, even Shakespeare. Not what she expected from a frontier rancher. "You read philosophy?" she asked. A shadow of self-consciousness crossed his weathered face. A man needs to feed his mind the same as his body. She picked up Walden, which was open to a marked passage. "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." "You agree with him?" she asked. Matthew thought about it, pouring more coffee. "Some men do, but not all. Some find a purpose even in desperate times." She wondered what desperate times he had known. The evidence was all around in his cabin. The patched clothes, the single, tin plate, the cavalry coat hanging by the door. It was blue, not gray. The slight limp he had when he walked, favoring his right leg. "You were with the Union?" she asked. His face went still. "Yes, ma'am. 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry. The war has been over for 20 years. Some things do not end just because the shooting stops," he said, quietly handing her the coffee. "You from around here, Elizabeth?" The way he said her name made it sound like something precious, something true. "Timberline," she answered, which was not exactly a lie. "That explains the coat." He nodded to her expensive garment, now drying by the fire. "Not many folks in these parts can afford European wool and real silver buttons." She had not realized he would notice such details. "My father is comfortable," she admitted. "He will be worried." Yes, he would be, but she did not say any more. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving the world clean and quiet, like a second chance written in fresh snow. The dawn came cold and bright. "Storm's broken," Matthew said. "You will want to get back before another one rolls in." Elizabeth nodded, though a part of her did not want to leave. This cabin, as rough and poor as it was, felt more honest and safe than her father's mansion ever had. They ate together one last time. More beans and weak coffee. "Can I ask you something?" Elizabeth said. Matthew looked up. "How did you end up out here all alone like this?" He was quiet for a long moment, and then he spoke real slow and deliberate, like a fella not used to sharing his troubles. "Lost my family's land to debt about 5 years ago. After the war, the taxes just kept climbing, and the bank's interest. My daddy passed from the consumption back in '79. Mama followed him just 6 months later. My brother, he never made it back from Antietam." As he spoke, his hand drifted down to his right leg, almost without him knowing. "I took a mini ball that very same day, tore right through the bone. The doctors, they were all set to take the leg. I told him no." He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred. "The bank took every last thing. 20 acres my own granddaddy cleared with his bare hands. The house my father built piece by piece. Now I just work another man's cattle. Live on a little patch at the edge of his property." You could see his jaw tighten up. "The folks in town, they call me worthless. The big landowners, they won't even give me the time of day." He looked right up then, straight into her eyes. "But I've still got my word, and a man's word is all the real wealth he needs." Elizabeth felt something just shatter inside her chest. This man, this good and decent soul, had absolutely nothing to his name, and yet he had saved her life. He had even shared his last bit of food with her. She almost told him right then and there. The words were on her tongue. "I'm Elizabeth Prescott. My father owns the very bank that likely took your land. I could change your whole life." But a cold fear just froze her solid. What if telling him changed everything? What if this kindness, this pure and simple goodness, was only there because he didn't know who she really was? "If there's some way I can repay you," she began, but Matthew just shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. That's just what neighbors are for." And with that, she stood up. She gathered her belongings. He'd already saddled a horse for her, one of the only two he owned, and he offered it freely, not asking for a thing in return. At the door, she turned back. "Thank you, Matthew. You just let me be the kind of man I aim to be, Elizabeth," he said, his voice low. "That's all the payment I need." Elizabeth swung up onto the horse. The cold air cut right through her coat. She turned in the saddle one last time, looking back at that little cabin. Matthew was standing there on the porch just watching her go. For a second, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Something. Fragile but real. Then she turned the horse and rode away. Her hand went to the locket around her neck. The secret felt heavier now, like a stone in her pocket she couldn't set down. Rich or poor, a blizzard buries everyone all the same. But once the snow melts, the world remembers who you are. And Elizabeth, Well, she wasn't so sure she wanted to be that person anymore. Samuel Prescott stood at his study window, watching the snow blanket his 20-acre estate. It was the finest house in all of Timberline, maybe the finest in the whole Montana Territory. 3 whole stories of Victorian grandeur, with big curved glass windows brought all the way from Philadelphia. The furniture came from New York, the staff from San Francisco. It was a monument to the fortune he'd built up during the war, selling the Union Army everything from boots to bullets. "Any word?" he asked without even turning around. James Sullivan, his partner in business, stood right behind him, holding his hat in his hands. At 45, Sullivan was a good 15 years younger than Prescott, and he was ambitious, with a hungry look of a man who'd had a taste of real money and was craving a whole lot more. "Nothing yet, sir. The men are out searching every farm and homestead for 20 miles around. But this storm, I don't give a damn about the storm." Samuel spun around, his face as hard as the granite of his fireplace. "My daughter has been gone for nearly 2 full days. Find her." "Yes, sir." Sullivan paused for a second. "The engagement announcement can wait until she is found," Samuel snapped. The local paper had been all set to print the news of the engagement between Elizabeth Prescott and James Sullivan, a deal that would merge the 2 biggest fortunes in the whole territory. It was an arrangement that suited both men just fine. Enormously, in fact. If only his headstrong daughter would just play along for once. Samuel turned back to the snow falling outside. Sarah would have known how to handle her. Sarah, his wife, gone 15 years now from the consumption. She took all the softness from his world with her, leaving him with a daughter who was just too much. Like her mother. Full of ideals and stubborn as a mule. "You tell Harkins if he doesn't find her by sunrise tomorrow, he's done. Tell every last one of them. Nobody sleeps until my daughter is home safe." Sullivan just nodded and backed on out of the room. Samuel's eyes drifted up to the portrait over the mantel. It was Sarah in her wedding dress, with a little Elizabeth standing beside her. From back before, the coffin started. Before he saw the blood on the handkerchiefs, before he buried his heart in a pine box and turned to the only comfort he had left, building an empire that nothing and nobody could ever tear down. "Where are you, girl?" he whispered to the falling snow. Well, news travels faster than a prairie fire in a town with nothing better to do. Elizabeth came riding back to her father's estate about 3 hours later, sitting atop Matthew's old mare. The ranch hands were the first to spot her. They were relieved, but then they got a little worried when they saw that unfamiliar horse. And within the hour, the whole territory knew it. The Prescott heiress had been saved by Matthew Hayes. That broke rancher. The fellow with no land to his name, no nothing. He had no prospects, no future to speak of. The town was split right down the middle over it. Some folks, well, they admired Matthew's grit, said it takes a real man to ride headfirst into a storm like that one. That's what Judge William Davidson said. Right there in the Mercantile, loud enough for the whole place to hear. The old Union judge lost an arm at Shiloh, but he'd earned respect from everyone around. He was known for being fair in land disputes. "Risked his own life for a stranger," the judge said. "Now that's what we fought for." But other folks, they just mocked him, figured he thought he'd get a reward out of it, sneered James Sullivan, leaning against the post office. "Maybe marry into money. That's what poor men do. Just wait for a lucky break." Elizabeth heard all that talk, and it just turned her stomach. She tried to send him a proper thank you gift. Good quality tools, winter supplies, things a man like Matthew could really use. She had one of her father's ranch hands take it. She gave orders to deliver it quietly, you see. But Matthew, he refused it, right out in public. It all went down at the Mercantile on a Saturday afternoon with the whole town looking on. The ranch hand pulled up with the wagon. Matthew was inside, buying a sack of grain he could hardly afford. "Miss Prescott sends her thanks," the ranch hand said, pointing to the tools. "Says you earned these." Matthew looked over at those tools. You could tell it was good steel, worth months of his wages just sitting there. But he just shook his head. "I didn't do it for pay," he said. "Take them back." Well, you could have heard a pin drop in that store. Then James Sullivan decided to speak up. Now, Sullivan was everything Matthew wasn't. Rich, schooled, and felt the world owed him. He'd been courting Elizabeth for a good 2 years, just assuming her daddy would come to his senses and approve the match. Mighty convenient, Sullivan said with a cold little smile on his face. You just happening to be there right when she needed saving. Matthew turned real slow. You could see his jaw tighten up, but his voice stayed steady. Ain't nothing convenient about a blizzard. Sullivan took a step closer. She belongs with her own kind, Hayes, not with some charity case. The whole mercantile just held its breath. Matthew met Sullivan's eyes. I reckon she belongs with whoever treats her like a person, not a piece of property. Then he paid for his grain and walked right out. Those tools just sat there on the wagon, untouched, flat out refused. Gold couldn't keep a man warm in a storm. Only a fire and a strong heart could do that. But gold sure did make people mean after the fact. Matthew rode home by himself. Those tools stayed right there in town, a shining example of the line that money draws. Back on his porch, Matthew just sat and watched the sun go down. The mountains looked like they were on fire, all orange and purple, beautiful and uncaring. He thought about Elizabeth. He wondered if she'd heard what Sullivan said, wondered if it even mattered to her. Probably not, he figured. Rich folks and poor folks, they just don't mix. Never have, never will. But for one day, caught in that storm, none of it seemed to matter. And Matthew couldn't get his mind off the way she'd mended his shirt, the gentle care in her hands. He thought about the quiet between them, a quiet that felt more like home than anything. He went inside and shut the door. Outside, the cold began to settle in for the night. Meanwhile, Elizabeth stood in her bedroom, staring at her own reflection in a fancy imported mirror. She hardly recognized the woman looking back. 2 days in that simple cabin had changed something deep inside her. Or maybe it just revealed what had been there all along. The door swung open. Her father walked right in without knocking, just like he always did. You had the entire county out looking for you, Samuel said. There was no hug, no sign of relief in his voice, just blame. What in the world were you thinking, riding out in that kind of weather? I needed some space to think, Elizabeth replied. The storm came up faster than I expected. You could have died out there. I nearly did. Matthew Hayes saved my life. Samuel's face went hard as a rock when he heard that name. Yes, the drifter. I've heard all about it. He is not a drifter. He works Judge Wilson's cattle. He has his own cabin. On borrowed land, the man lost his family's farm. Sounds like poor management to me. Elizabeth spun around, her anger flaring up. Poor management? The banks raised their rates right after the war. Good men who fought for their country came home to find their families drowning in debt. That's exactly what happened to Matthew's family. Samuel just waved his hand like he was shooing a fly. Business is business. The weak fall behind. The strong survive. Is that what Mother would say? Elizabeth knew it was a low blow, using her mother Sarah against him. But she couldn't forget the look in Matthew's eyes when he talked about losing his family's land. The very same land his own grandfather had cleared with his bare hands. Samuel went stiff as a board. You will not speak of your mother that way. She's the one who taught me compassion. She taught me to see folks as people, not just numbers on a ledger. Compassion doesn't build empires, Samuel shot back. He walked to the window, looking out over his massive estate. I have worked too hard and come too far to watch you throw it all away on some silly romantic idea about a penniless cowboy. I am not throwing anything away. He saved my life, and I just wanted to thank him properly. You sent him tools worth a month's wages. He deserved them, and he refused them. In public, he embarrassed our family name. Elizabeth's face clouded over. What? Your so-called hero? Made a real show of turning down that Prescott charity. This afternoon, the whole town saw it. Samuel turned back to her. Sullivan was there. He said Hayes acted like he was too good for a helping hand. Pride, the last thing a man has when he's got nothing else. Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed. Matthew had refused her gift. Not because he didn't need it, but because... What? Because it came from her. Because he found out who she really was. The engagement announcement is going in the paper. Monday, Samuel went on, you are going to marry Sullivan this spring. The arrangements have been made. I never agreed to marry him, Elizabeth said softly. This is not about agreement. This is about securing our family's standing. Sullivan has connections in Washington. Together, you two will inherit the largest financial empire in the entire territory. I do not love him, Samuel laughed, a short, bitter sound. Love? Your mother loved me. And look at the good it did her. Buried at 42. He moved to the door. Get some rest. You have had an ordeal. Sullivan will come calling tomorrow. You will receive him properly. The door closed behind him. Elizabeth sat motionless, just staring into space. Then her eyes fell on her riding boots, still caked with mud and snow. She made a decision. She was going to see Matthew again. She needed to understand why he had refused her gift. Needed to know if he had changed now that he knew her name. The next morning, she rose before the dawn. Before her father could stop her, before she could stop herself, Elizabeth saddled her horse quietly and slipped out through the back gate. The ranch hands pretended not to see her. They liked her, knew she was different from her father. The ride to Matthew's place took a full hour. The sunrise caught her halfway. Pink and gold spilled across the mountains, making the snow glitter like a million tiny stars. She found him in the corral, mending a fence. He looked up when he heard the hooves. Surprise flickered across his face. Then something warmer. He set down his tools and wiped his hands on his pants. Was not expecting company, Matthew said. I wanted to thank you properly, Elizabeth said, getting down from her horse. I told you you do not need to thank me. I know. She stepped closer. But I wanted to see you again. That just hung there between them. Honest and raw. Matthew nodded toward the cabin. Coffee is on. They walked together. Elizabeth watched him move. Simple, purposeful, no wasted motion. A man who had learned to make do with very little. Inside, she looked around properly this time. She saw the details. The hand-carved chair, the shelf holding 3 books, the window facing east to catch the morning light. You built this yourself? She asked. Most of it took 2 years. Elizabeth ran her hand along the table. Smooth, solid, it is beautiful. Matthew poured coffee. They sat across from each other just like they had during the storm. Why did you refuse the tools? She asked. You could have used them. I did not want folks thinking I helped you for personal gain. His eyes met hers. Some things should be done because they are right, not because there is a reward. Not everyone thinks that way. Not everyone spent 4 years watching men die for something they believed in, he said quietly. It changes how you see things. Elizabeth nodded. My father thinks I am being foolish. He says I have romanticized you because you saved me. Matthew's face gave nothing away. And have you? No, she looked down at her coffee. I think I see you clearly. That is why I am here. What do you dream about? She asked suddenly. Matthew blinked. What? When you are out here mending a fence, riding alone? What do you dream about? He was quiet for a long time. I used to dream about land, having my own place again, passing it to my kids someday. He looked at his coffee. Now I just want to be the kind of man worth remembering. That is enough. Elizabeth felt something crack open right inside her. Here was a man with nothing, dreaming only of being good. You do not know who I am, she said quietly. Matthew looked at her. I know enough. I know you mended my shirt. I know you were not afraid to work beside me during the storm. That is plenty. She wanted to tell him right then, wanted to confess everything. The wealth, the expectations, the cage her life had become. But Matthew stood and gestured to the corral. Come on, I will show you something. They walked outside. The sun was higher now, warm in the air. Matthew led her to the fence line, showed her the cattle grazing below. Not mine, he said, but I take care of them like they are. That matters. They stood there, their shoulders almost touching. Elizabeth looked at him. Really looked. She saw the lines around his eyes from squinting at the sun and snow. The scar on the set of his jaw. That quiet strength in the way he carried himself. Matthew. He turned his head. Their faces were right there, a little too close. For a heartbeat, the whole world just seemed to stop and hold its breath. And then, Matthew took a small step back. I ought to get back to my work, he said. Elizabeth just nodded, a lump forming in her throat. I should be going. They walked to her horse without another word. She swung up into the saddle and looked down at him. I appreciate everything you've done. It was my pleasure, Miss Prescott. She spurred her horse on, never once looking back. But high up on the ridge, her father's men were keeping a close eye on things. Two riders, just dark shapes against the sky. The bright sky. Elizabeth caught sight of them. Her stomach just fell away. This was not over. Not by a long shot. A woman who was not scared of a little hard work was a rare thing, rarer than a cool breeze in August. But a woman who went against her own father's wishes, well, that was downright dangerous. And Elizabeth had just stepped clear over a line she could never step back from. The two men watched her ride on, back towards town, and then they looked at one another. Sullivan had paid them good money to follow her, to report every little thing. One of them pulled out a small notebook and started scribbling down the time and the place. It was evidence, you see, the kind of ammunition that could tear a person's good name to shreds. Down in the distance, Matthew went back to mending his fence with no idea that just sharing a cup of coffee with Elizabeth Prescott had kicked a rock loose that was going to start an avalanche that would soon swallow them both. Some storms, they come from the sky, and others, they brew up right in the hearts of men. Both kinds could be just as deadly. Now, Timberline was not a big town, barely 500 souls calling it home. But like any place folks gather, there were invisible lines drawn all through it, just as sure as the fences that marked property lines. The north side of town, that belonged to the merchants and the bankers. Their big Victorian houses sat way back from the wide streets. The south side was for the laborers, the ranch hands, and all the folks whose luck had run out after the war. And right between them stood the mercantile, the church, and the Red Eagle Saloon. That was neutral ground, where all those lines got a little blurry after the sun went down. Monday morning found the mercantile packed to the gills. Fresh. Supplies had just rolled in from Helena, drawing folks from all over the county. Judge William Davidson was standing near the counter, his empty left sleeve pinned up, neatly to his side. It was a reminder of a rebel shell from the fight at Shiloh. At 65 years old, the judge still stood straight as a board and had clear eyes. His silver hair and beard making him look like some prophet straight out of the Old Testament. 4 pounds of coffee beans, he told Carl Weber, the German fella who ran the store, and any letters that might have come in on the stage. Weber nodded, scooping coffee into a paper sack. Heard about that Prescott girl, Judge. They say she was found half froze out in the storm. I heard, was all Davidson said. His voice gave nothing away. That Hayes fella is the one who pulled her out. Rode right into the teeth of that blizzard to get her. The judge's eyebrow went up just a little. Matthew Hayes, you say? The veteran working out at Wilson's place? The very same. That man's got sand, I will give him that. Just then the little bell over the door jingled. The talk in the store just died away as James Sullivan stepped inside. He took off his fine beaver hat, brushing the snow from his tailored coat. 4 ranch hands followed him in. You could tell by their gear they were Prescott's men. Sullivan spotted Davidson and gave a short little nod, but it was the kind of nod that was shy of any real respect. Judge, fine morning, Sullivan. Davidson's reply was cold as a January wind. Those 2 men had crossed swords before, right there in land court. Sullivan always represented the Prescott interests, which had a funny way of growing at the expense of the poor homesteaders trying to make a go of it. Sullivan walked up to the counter and handed Weber a list. Mr. Prescott's monthly order. Yes, sir, Mr. Sullivan. Weber took the list, and his whole manner just changed. He got all fawning and agreeable. Behind Sullivan, his ranch hands spread out through the store. Their presence just seemed to suck the air out of the room, pushing other folks to the side. Price of coffee has gone up. Again, Weber said, a little nervous. Supply troubles down in Brazil. Mr. Prescott pays the price that was listed on last month's contract, Sullivan shot back. The ups and downs of the market are your problem, Weber, not his. Weber's face turned red, but he just nodded. Everybody in that room knew Prescott's credit was what kept half the businesses in town from going under. Judge Davidson watched the whole thing with narrowed eyes. The law of contracts cuts both ways, Sullivan. A merchant has a right to fair pay for his goods. Sullivan turned around, a smile on his face that had no humor in it at all. Legal advice is always welcome, Judge, but I do believe Mr. Weber and Prescott Enterprises have a perfect understanding between them. Perfectly. The little bell jingled again, and in walked Matthew Hayes, stamping the snow from his worn-out boots. If the room was quiet before, it was dead silent now. Hayes had on his usual old cavalry coat, patched-up trousers, and about a week's worth of stowable on his face. His clouded right eye caught the light as he looked around the room, his gaze stopping for just a second on Sullivan, before he moved on to the counter. "Morning, Carl," he said, his voice low and steady. "Need some grain for my horses. 20 pounds. Weber just nodded, looking as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "Right away." Away, Mr. Hayes Sullivan watched Matthew like a man studying some strange kind of bug. "Well, Hayes, the whole town's buzzing about you playing the hero. Mighty convenient, you stumbling across the Prescott girl." Matthew turned real slow. Wasn't looking for anybody. Just saw a soul in trouble. Of course, that slick smile on Sullivan's face never wavered. "Stayed put. How noble of you. Elizabeth was mighty taken with your simple hospitality." The ranch hands behind him let out a little chuckle. Matthew's face was like stone, but that good eye of his turned hard as granite. "Miss Prescott was a fine guest. Never said a word of complaint about my home." "Oh yes, well she's always been kind to the less fortunate." Sullivan's voice echoed through the whole store. "She even sent a little something to show her thanks." "I believe she did, and you turned it down for all to see." Matthew locked eyes with him. Sullivan's stare. "I didn't do it for no reward." "No?" Sullivan took a step closer. "Then what did you do it for, Hayes? Surely not just out of the goodness of your own heart." Just then, Judge Davidson stepped right between them, making some room. "I'd say saving a life doesn't need any explaining, Sullivan. Most fellas who wore the uniform understand that." Sullivan's jaw clenched up at that hidden jab. He'd spent the war looking after his daddy's business, never putting on a uniform. "As educational as this has been, gentlemen, I've got business to see to." Sullivan grabbed his hat. "Hayes, I'm certain Elizabeth is grateful for your silence about the time she spent under your roof. A lady's good name is a fragile thing, you know." That threat just hung in the air, plain as a rattlesnake ready to strike. But Matthew's voice stayed calm and steady. "And even a real gentleman protects a lady's honor. He doesn't cast doubt on it. You could have heard a pin drop in that store." Sullivan's face turned red, but he got himself together right quick. "Indeed. Good day to you, gentlemen." As Sullivan and his boys walked out, Judge Davidson turned to Matthew. "That man's got the moral compass of a rabid coyote." Matthew just nodded, "Paying Mr. Weber for his grain. It don't matter. He's got nothing I want." "Don't you be so sure," the judge said, watching through the window. As Sullivan swung up on his horse, "You've got his attention now, son, and that ain't usually a blessing." Matthew hoisted the heavy sack of grain. "Judge, with all due respect, I face down Confederate cannons. A fella like Sullivan doesn't scare me much." A little smile formed on Davidson's weathered face. "Artillery lets you know it's coming, son. Men like Sullivan, they like to strike from where you can't see 'em." He adjusted his hat with his good hand. "Where'd you serve?" 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry. They called us the Sabres." The judge nodded, a look of real respect on his face. "That was some hard fighting at Chickamauga." "Yes, sir. We lost a lot of good men that day." The judge looked him over. "You know, Hayes, I could surely use a man with your kind of experience. My clerk lit out for California last month. The job's open if it interests you. Pays a whole lot better than punching cows." Matthew looked genuinely surprised. "I surely appreciate the offer, Judge, but I ain't much for sitting behind a desk." "Well, you think on it. This town could use more men who ride into a storm instead of running from it." Judge Davidson picked up his coffee. "Good day to you, Hayes." Outside, Matthew tied the grain sack to his saddle, his mind replaying their talk. That offer came right out of the blue. A clerk for the county judge. That meant steady pay, some respect, a future that was more than just getting by. But it also meant living in town, dealing with politics, and picking sides in the quiet war that was splitting Timberline right down the middle. He swung up on his horse, not knowing that right across the street, Sarah Davidson was watching him from her father's office window. The judge's daughter had seen the whole thing play out in the store. At 25 years old, Sarah had her daddy's straight-ahead gaze and her late mother's fiery red hair. She was unmarried by her own choosing, not for a lack of fellas trying. She helped her father run his affairs, both in the courthouse and at home. Sarah spotted Matthew right away, his lonely shape getting smaller and smaller against those snow-dusted mountains. Then she turned back to the papers spread all over her desk. Land deeds, banknotes, tax liens, all just pieces of a big puzzle her father had been putting together for months. It was a pattern of foreclosures, spreading across the county like a sickness. And every single road led right back to Prescott Enterprises and James Sullivan. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Prescott sat in her father's study, her back ramrod straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, just like she'd been taught since she was a little girl. She was a child. Across the way, Samuel Prescott looked over his papers, making her wait on purpose. That huge oak desk, brought all the way from Boston at a mighty high price, was like a big wall between the two of them. The announcement, Samuel finally said, will be in tomorrow's newspaper, finally not looking up. Sullivan has already ordered champagne clear from San Francisco for the engagement dinner next week. But I never said I would marry him. Elizabeth said in a low voice, "This ain't about getting my approval, Father." Samuel set his pen down real slow. "This is about your duty to the Prescott name. Is it my duty to marry a man who treats folks the way Sullivan does?" Elizabeth leaned in, her eyes flashing. "You should have heard him at the store, just tearing down Matthew Hayes in front of everybody. After that man saved my life." Samuel's expression turned to granite. "Hayes is just a failed farmer who ran his inheritance straight into the ground. Sullivan, on the other hand, is building an empire with our money and our name, with vision and ambition." Samuel stood up and walked over to the window. "Your mother, bless her soul, would have understood why this has to happen. My mother would have seen Sullivan for exactly what he is. And what is that?" Elizabeth held his gaze, steady as a rock. "A man who only sees the dollar sign on a person. A businessman, you mean?" Samuel's voice went cold as a winter creek. "Like your father." "You were not always this way." Elizabeth's voice softened just a bit. "Before Mama passed, you cared about people, not just how much money they could make you." Samuel turned his back on her sharply. "Feelings are a luxury we cannot afford, Elizabeth." Just then a knock at the door broke the tension. The housekeeper peeked in, looking mighty nervous. "Mr. Sullivan is here, sir. Show him in," Samuel said, straightening his vest. "Elizabeth, you will be polite. This conversation is over." James Sullivan walked in with the kind of swagger a man gets when he owns everything he sees. He was holding a little velvet box and a bunch of hothouse flowers that must have cost a fortune to get in the middle of a Montana February. "Samuel." The two men shook hands. "Elizabeth, you are looking absolutely radiant today." Elizabeth just gave a little nod, not saying a word. Sullivan either did not notice or did not care about her cold shoulder. He put the flowers on the desk. "I have brought you something else as well." He opened that little velvet box, and inside was a diamond ring that sparkled like ice in the winter sun. "A little something for our future together." "It is beautiful," she said, but her voice was flat as a prairie. "It was my grandmother's. The Sullivan women have worn it for 3 generations. He took it out of the box. "May I?" But before Elizabeth could even answer, he took her hand and slid that ring right onto her finger. It felt heavy, like a beautiful chain. A perfect fit. Sullivan smiled as if fate itself had decided it. Samuel watched the whole thing, a look of approval on his face. "James also has some big news about that Washington contract. The territorial governor himself has recommended our bid for the Army supply contract." "That is 5 years of guaranteed business," Sullivan chimed in. "Military outposts all over Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Prescott Sullivan Enterprises is going to be the biggest business in the whole territory." "Congratulations," Elizabeth said, her eyes fixed on the ring that felt like a brand on her finger. "I was thinking we could announce it at our engagement dinner," Sullivan went on. "The governor has already said he will be there, and several of the territorial legislators as well," Samuel added with a nod. "Excellent. Elizabeth, why do you not show James the dining room preparations?" It was a clear dismissal. Elizabeth rose, leading Sullivan out into the hall. The second they were alone in that big formal dining room, Sullivan grabbed her arm and turned her around to face him. "You seem a little distant today." "It has been a hard week," she said. His fingers tightened just a little. I heard you went to see that Hayes fella again, even after your father told you not to. Elizabeth went rigid. You have had someone following me. I have been protecting your good name. Sullivan's voice dropped low. Do you have any earthly idea what people are saying? The Prescott heiress visiting some bachelor out at his cabin? I was chaperone. He saved my life, and he has been thanked for it. And yet, you keep going back to see him. Sullivan's eyes narrowed to little slits. People are going to talk. Then let them talk. His grip got even tighter. Your father has worked his whole life to build this family standing. I am not about to let you throw that all away for some silly idea about a cowboy with empty pockets. Elizabeth finally yanked her arm free. You sound just like my father. I will take that as a compliment. Sullivan straightened his suit coat. Your father sees the world for what it is, not some fairy tale. Hayes is a nobody, a ghost from a war that is long over, a man who lost his own family's land. You do not know the first thing about him. Oh, I know everything about him, Sullivan shot back. I make it my business to know about everybody in this county. Matthew Hayes, 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry, took a bullet at Antietam, family farm taken by the Montana Territorial Bank back in 1880 because he could not pay his debts. Right now, he is working for Judge Wilson as a ranch hand, making $30 a month. Elizabeth just stared at him, a chill running down her spine at how cold he sounded. I also know, Sullivan continued, that this little crush of yours is going to end. Right now, your future is with me. Me, and the sooner you get that through your head, the better off we'll all be. The threat in his voice was as clear as day. Are you threatening me, James? I'm just making things clear. That cold, practiced smile of his came right back. Now, how about we talk about this dinner menu? I went ahead and ordered some French wine. In 1871 Bordeaux, a mighty fine year. A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine, and it had nothing to do with the Montana winter. In Sullivan's eyes, she didn't see love or even a hint of desire, just cold calculation. It was the same look he'd give a good business deal. Meanwhile, Matthew spent his afternoon mending a fence on the west side of Judge Wilson's property. It was the kind of work that let a man's mind drift. He got to thinking about Judge Davidson's offer. That clerk job would mean steady hours, sleeping in a real bed every night, and maybe saving up enough to buy a little piece of land for himself one day. Then his thoughts turned to Elizabeth Prescott. He pictured her riding away from his cabin that morning, sitting tall in the saddle, so determined. He thought about that quiet understanding that had started to grow between them during that storm, and how she wasn't anything like her father's world. The sound of horses pulled him right out of his thoughts. Two men were riding up, Prescott's men. You could tell by their gear. Matthew knew him from town, Boyd and Miller. Both had ridden with the Confederate cavalry during the war, and neither one of them had ever given him the time of day. Hayes, one of them called out as they got closer, taking a little break from playing the hero. Matthew put down his tools. Something I can help you boys with. Just passing through, Miller said. But they didn't seem to be going anywhere. Just checking fences. Same as you. Prescott's land is a good 3 miles east of here, Matthew pointed out. Boyd just smirked. Mr. Sullivan asked us to look over the nearby properties. Looks like Mr. Prescott is thinking about buying up Wilson's spread. Matthew's face showed nothing at all, but that news hit him like a punch to the gut. Judge Wilson was getting on in years, and he'd been talking about moving back east to be with his daughter. If Prescott bought this land, Matthew would be out of a job and a home. Wilson hasn't said a thing to me about selling. A man his age with his health failing, Miller just shrugged, makes sense for him to cash out while he still can. Well, that's his business. Matthew went back to his work, hammering a staple into the post a little harder than he needed to. Sure is, Boyd said, leaning on his saddle horn. Heard you've been entertaining company lately. Seems Miss Prescott took a real shine to your hospitality. Matthew stood up straight, looking Boyd right in the eye. Just say what you came here to say. Just some friendly advice, Boyd said, his voice getting hard. Miss Prescott is engaged to Mr. Sullivan. A woman like her doesn't belong with a man like you. Is that her thinking, or is it Sullivan's? A smart man would watch his mouth, Miller cut in, and watch his back. A smart man would deliver his message and be on his way, Matthew answered, his voice steady. before this turns into something none of us want. The three of them stood there, frozen for a long moment. Old hatreds from a war that was supposed to be long over were bubbling right under the surface. Finally, Boyd gave a slow nod. Message delivered. Enjoy this view while it lasts, Hayes. This ain't gonna be your home for much longer. They turned their horses and rode off. Matthew just watched them go, his mind racing. The threat was plain as day. Stay away from Elizabeth Prescott. That news about Wilson's ranch could be true, or it could just be bait. Either way, the ground he was standing on was starting to feel mighty unstable. He finished up with the fence and got on his horse. But instead of heading back to his cabin, he pointed his horse west toward town. Judge Davison's offer was worth thinking about, especially now that his job here didn't feel so secure. The ride into town gave him time to think about his choices and what might come of them, about the road that had brought him to this place. He thought about the war that took his brother and his leg, and the hard years that followed. He tried to save the family farm while his folks' health gave out, but then came the foreclosure. It left him with nothing to his name but his horse. Soon enough, Timberline came into view. The afternoon shadows were getting long as Matthew rode straight for the courthouse, a sturdy brick building on the north end of town. He tied up his horse and walked up the steps, favoring his right leg a bit after the long day of work. Inside, he found Sarah Davidson all by herself, sorting through papers in the main office. She looked up, a little surprised to see him. "Mr. Hayes, can I help you with something?" "I'm looking for your father, ma'am. He mentioned something about a clerk position." Sarah put her papers down. "He's in court until about 4 o'clock. Are you interested in that job?" "I'm considering it." Matthew took off his hat, suddenly feeling out of place in his dusty work clothes and with his unshaven face. "Sarah." She looked him over with some very intelligent eyes. "The work is mostly keeping records. Things like land deals, legal papers, and court dates. My father needs a person who writes with a clear hand and who can make sense of basic legal talk. My own schooling is not much, but I can read and write just fine." She pointed toward a chair. "May I ask why you are interested in this position?" "My father mentioned that you work for Judge Wilson." Matthew paused for a moment, then figured the truth was best. "I heard Wilson might be selling his place to Prescott. Nothing is certain, but it seems like a wise move to consider my options." Suddenly, Sarah's whole expression changed. "When did you hear about this?" "Today. Some of Prescott's men mentioned it." She moved over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "Did they say when this sale might be happening?" "No, ma'am. Only that Judge Wilson's health was not good and he might want to sell out." Sarah opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. She let out a small scoff. "Judge Wilson visited this very office 3 days ago. He showed no signs of poor health, nor did he mention any thought of selling." Matthew took this in. It could just be idle talk then. "Perhaps," she said, putting the folder away. "Or it could be part of a pattern we have been watching." "We have, my father and I." Sarah leaned in just a little. "Mr. Hayes, what do you know about the recent land sales in this county?" The question felt a little strange. "Not much, really. I know the railroad has been buying up parcels along the new northern road. And who is it that represents the railroad's interests around here?" "Prescott Enterprises, I would suppose." Sarah nodded slowly. "Over the last 18 months, Prescott and Sullivan have taken over 17 properties in this county. Most of them belongs to war veterans or their widows. Every single one was foreclosed on by the Montana Territorial Bank." Matthew stiffened. "That is the same bank that took my family's land. The very same one." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "A bank where Samuel Prescott holds the controlling interest, even though his name is not on any of the public papers." The meaning of her words settled like a stone in Matthew's stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I am not suggesting anything yet. My father and I are still gathering the evidence." She studied his face carefully. "Your land was taken in 1880, on August the 15th. Do you still have the loan papers? The original agreement?" Matthew cleared his throat and shook his head. "The bank took everything. They said we were 3 months behind, but my father kept very careful records. We had paid right on time." The office door opened and Judge Davidson walked in, taking off his black judicial robes. He stopped short when he saw Matthew. "Hayes, I did not expect to see you again so soon." Matthew stood up. "I am considering your offer, sir, if it is still open." It is. Davidson hung his robes on a wall hook. But I get the feeling there is more to this visit. Sarah cut in. Mr. Hayes just told me that Prescott's men are saying Judge Wilson is selling his ranch. Judge Davidson's bushy eyebrows shot up. Wilson said nothing of this to me. We just played chess on Wednesday evening. They claimed his health was failing, Matthew added, that he wanted to cash out. The judge exchanged a knowing look with his daughter. That is very interesting timing, sir. Matthew looked back and forth between them. Davidson seemed to make a decision. Hayes, what I am about to tell you requires you to be discreet. My daughter and I have been investigating a series of very questionable land deals involving Prescott Enterprises and the Montana Territorial Bank. Sarah mentioned it. What she could not mention is that we have found proof of altered loan documents, interest rates that were changed after they were signed, payment records that the bank just happened to lose, properties taken even when the borrowers were up to date on their payments. Matthew's jaw tightened. That is theft. It is fraud, Davidson corrected him. But proving it requires the original documents that the borrowers signed, documents the bank has been very careful to either destroy or change. You think they are going after Wilson's ranch now? It fits their pattern. It is a large property right next to land Prescott already owns. It has an elderly owner and valuable water rights. Davidson moved to a map on the wall that showed all the land ownership in the county. Look right here. Every property you see in blue was acquired by Prescott in the last 2 years. Notice the pattern. Matthew studied the map. The blue properties formed a kind of corridor, stretching from the mountains down to the plains, following the watershed. They are securing access to the water. Precisely. In Montana, whoever controls the water controls absolutely everything. Davidson pointed to Wilson's property, which was marked in green. His ranch sits at a critical point in that watershed. With it, Prescott would control the water rights for half the county. Why are you telling me this? Because you have been a victim of their tactics, Davidson said plainly. And because I need a clerk I can trust, someone who understands what we are up against. Matthew's gaze shifted from the judge to Sarah, and he was weighing his options heavy. Going up against Prescott meant making some mighty powerful enemies. But walking away meant turning his back on any hope for justice. Not just for him, but for all the other folks who'd lost everything. The job pays $40 a month, Judge Davidson went on. That includes a room and your meals right next door. You'd start right away. Taking this job, Matthew said, thinking out loud, would put me square against Prescott and Sullivan. That it would, the judge agreed, and they'd see it as you turning on them. Matthew's mind drifted to Elizabeth, caught right in the middle of her loyalty to her father and what she knew was right. It would surely make things mighty difficult for everybody. Hard times have a way of finding us, whether we're looking for them or not, Davidson replied. The real question is if we face them on our feet or on our knees. Matthew stuck out his hand. I'll take the job, Judge. Davidson's handshake was strong as iron, even with just one arm. Welcome aboard, Hayes. Be here at 8 in the morning. Sarah will show you the ropes. As Matthew walked out of that courthouse, the weight of what he'd done settled on his shoulders. He'd just thrown in his lot, with the very man looking into Elizabeth's father for some shady dealings. He'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Outside, the setting sun was painting the tree line in shades of gold and long shadows. Up on the north side, the Prescott mansion stood like a fortress on the hill, its windows all aglow with lamplight. So close you could almost touch it, but a world away, separated by money, power, and now 2 different sides of the law. Matthew swung up onto his horse for the long ride back to the Wilson Ranch. Tomorrow a new chapter was set to begin, one that would either bring justice to this valley or cost him the last little bit he had. The Prescott mansion was lit up like a star, with every window shining bright against the cold winter dark. Fancy carriages were lined up all along the drive, letting out the most important folks in all of Montana for the engagement. Supper. Government men, bank presidents, railroad bosses. They all came to see that 2 powerful families joined together. Up in her room, Elizabeth stood still as a statue while her maid fastened the last little buttons on her gown. It was a fancy thing, all blue silk and French lace, that had just come in from New York only a few hours before. That big diamond ring felt like a lead weight on her finger. "You look absolutely beautiful, miss," the maid said, fussing with a curl. Elizabeth hardly heard a word. She was just lost in thought about the choice she had to make. Downstairs, 70 guests were waiting to hear the big news about her getting engaged to James Sullivan. Her father had already told the territorial governor, who was fixing to make a toast. The fella from the newspaper even had a special paper ready to print. It felt like there was no way out. That wouldn't stir up a scandal big enough to ruin her father completely. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Samuel Prescott walked in, looking grand in. His evening suit, his silver hair and beard, all neat and trimmed. "It's time," he said, offering her his arm. Elizabeth took it like she was in a daze. As they started toward the hallway, Samuel stopped for a moment. "Your mother would be so proud of you tonight," he said, his voice getting soft for a second. "She always wanted to see you safe and respected." "Did she really?" Elizabeth looked him right in the eye. "Or did she just want to see me happy?" Samuel's face went hard again. "Child, those are the same thing, if you understand them right." "No, they're not, and you know it," Elizabeth whispered. "Father, I've been hearing things about Mr. Sullivan, about the way he and the bank get a hold of property." Samuel went stiff as a board. "Just rumors, spread by folks who failed because they weren't smart enough. Judge Davidson doesn't seem like a fool to me. Davidson is a fossil, holding on to old grudges. That war ended 20 years ago, but men like him just keep on fighting it in new ways." Samuel's voice turned to steel. "Whatever you have heard, you forget it. Sullivan knows what the future of this land is. Together, you two will build something that lasts." "But at what cost?" Elizabeth pushed back. "I spoke with Sarah Davidson yesterday. She showed me the paperwork on foreclosures all over the county. There's a pattern to it, and it looks like it's on purpose." Samuel's face grew dark. "You went to Davidson's office? After I told you plain as day to stay away from that family? I wanted to know the truth. The truth is that doing business means you have to make hard choices. Weak men will call it being ruthless. Strong men call it having vision." He squeezed her arm a little tighter. "Now you pull yourself together. Our guests are waiting." The grand staircase swept down into a big hall filled with all of Montana's most powerful men. Every single eye in the room turned up to look at them. Elizabeth felt every stare like a hand on her shoulder. All their expectations were pressing in on her from every side. Sullivan was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, looking handsome in his fine suit, with a smug look of victory he could barely hide. Samuel beamed at the crowd as they reached the bottom of the stairs. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice full of pride, "thank y'all for joining us on this incredible evening. Tonight we are celebrating more than just an engagement. This is a partnership that will build the very future of the Montana Territory." A wave of applause went through the room. Sullivan stepped forward and took Elizabeth's hand from her father's arm. His fingers felt like ice against her skin. "Elizabeth has made me the happiest man alive," Sullivan declared for all to hear. "Together we will build on the strong foundation her fine father has laid, creating opportunities that will help every single person in this territory." The crowd clapped again. The territorial governor then stepped up, raising his champagne glass. "To the future Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, may their union bring prosperity to all of Montana." Glasses clinked all around. Elizabeth felt Sullivan's arms snake around her waist, a tight, possessive grip, as he soaked up the congratulations. Peeking through the crowd, she saw faces she knew. Judge Wilson looked mighty uncomfortable in his fancy suit. Then there was the banker who had taken the Hayes family's farm, now looking fat and happy with his success. And the newspaper editor, who only printed what Prescott's money told him to. And near the back, half hidden by a pillar, was Sarah Davidson. For just a second, their eyes met across the room. Sarah gave a tiny, almost invisible nod and slipped something out of her handbag, placing it on a small table near the door before she quietly slipped out. The rest of the evening was just a blur of toasts, music, and well wishes. Elizabeth played her part perfectly, smiling and thanking everyone, accepting good wishes she knew were hollow. When the last guest finally left after midnight, she dragged herself up the stairs to her room, too tired to even think. But there on her dressing table was a folded note that was not there before. With trembling fingers, Elizabeth opened it. It read, "Court records show your father knew the Hayes farm was all paid up when he ordered the foreclosure. Matthew Hayes is now working with us, looking into these very cases. If you want to know the truth, come to the courthouse tomorrow about 10 in the morning. Destroy this note. SD." Elizabeth just stared at the words, their meaning hitting her like a punch and burning through her exhaustion. Her own father had knowingly and wrongly taken the Hayes family farm. This was the same man who was now forcing her to marry Sullivan, the man behind so many similar schemes all over the county. She tossed the note into the fireplace, watching the paper curl up and turn black, taking with it the very last of her illusions about her father's business dealings. Morning just could not come soon enough. At the crack of dawn, Matthew was already organizing documents in the courthouse records room. He had spent half the night moving his few belongings into a small apartment over the feed store, thanks to Judge Davidson. Judge Wilson had accepted his resignation, sad to see him go, but understanding why. "Good timing," and Wilson had said. "I had a visit from Prescott yesterday. He offered to buy this place right out from under me. He said my health looked poor and I ought to think about selling before winter sets in." Matthew kept sorting through property deeds, putting them in order by date, just as Sarah had instructed. The work was slow going, but it was sure telling a story. These papers showed a clear pattern of Prescott's growing empire. Property after property was snatched up through foreclosures and tax sales, always spreading out along the watershed. "Looks like you've made some good progress." Sarah's voice came from the doorway. She was carrying a tray with coffee and biscuits. "My father says you've got a real knack for organization." "The Army teaches you to keep things squared away," Matthew said, taking the coffee with a grateful nod. "I found something mighty interesting," he said. "Every single one of these foreclosed properties had their loans handled by the very same bank officer, a James Sullivan." Sarah nodded. Before he became Prescott's partner, Sullivan was the chief loan officer at the Montana Territorial Bank. He personally oversaw every one of these deals. "Well, that cannot be a coincidence," Matthew stated. "It is not," she said. Then paused for a moment. "I invited someone to join us this morning, someone I believe can help our investigation." But before Matthew could even ask who, the outer door opened. Sarah stepped out, and he could hear her voice, low and steady in conversation. A moment later, she returned, with Elizabeth Prescott right beside her. Matthew shot to his feet, the surprise clear on his face. Elizabeth was wearing a simple blue dress, with her hair pulled back. None of the fancy things he'd have expected after that big engagement dinner last night. Their eyes met, and he could see a battle going on in her eyes, a mix of determination and doubt. "Mr. Hayes," her voice was formal and tightly controlled, "I understand you are now working with Judge Davidson." "Yes, ma'am, I just started yesterday." Elizabeth then turned to Sarah. "You mentioned you had documents, some kind of evidence?" Sarah pulled a folder from her desk. "These are just the copies of bank records my father got with a court order. They show the real, original loan terms for a whole mess of properties, including the Hayes family farm." Elizabeth took the folder, opening it real careful like. "And these right here prove it was fraud. They show the difference between what folks signed and what the bank claimed later on. Interest rates altered. Payment records all doctored up." Sarah pointed to a few lines. "Now, in Mr. Hayes's case, the bank claimed 3 missed payments. But these records show every single payment was made right on time." All the color drained from Elizabeth's face as she looked over the papers. "My father's signature is on these authorization forms." "That's right. As the bank president, he approved every last foreclosure." Matthew watched Elizabeth's expression change as the awful truth started to sink in. Her own father wasn't just mixed up in all this. He was the one pulling the strings. "And there's more," Sarah went on. "We have good reason to believe Sullivan and your daddy are aiming for Judge Wilson's ranch next. They've already been talking to him about selling it." Elizabeth slowly closed the folder. "Why are you showing me all this?" "Because you need to know exactly what kind of man your future husband is." Sarah's voice was soft but steady as a rock. All that money and success from Prescott Enterprises was built on the backs of good families, like Mr. Hayes's. Elizabeth turned her eyes to Matthew. "Did you know I was coming here?" No, ma'am. He looked right at her, his gaze never wavering. I would never use you against your father, no matter what he has done. And yet, you took this job to investigate him. I took this job to find the truth. Matthew stood up a little straighter. Your father took everything my family had. If he did the same thing to other folks, then that truth needs to see the light of day. Elizabeth looked from one to the other, a decision starting to form deep in her eyes. What y'all are doing, it could destroy my father, his reputation, his entire business. Yes, Sarah admitted quietly, it surely could. And my engagement to James Sullivan, well, that would become mighty complicated to keep. Elizabeth walked over to the window, just staring out at the snow on the timberline. When she finally turned around, the doubt was gone from her face, replaced by pure resolve. What is it you need from me? Sarah and Matthew shared a quick look. Access to your father's private files, any letters between him and Sullivan about these properties. We need proof they knew these foreclosures were just plain wrong. You're asking me to turn on my own father, Sarah. No, I'm asking you to stand for the truth, she replied, no matter what might come of it. Elizabeth's hand drifted up to her throat, right where that gold locket with the Prescott family crest was rested under her dress. The weight of her family name, of what everyone expected, felt heavy on her heart. I need some time to think on this. She handed the folder back to Sarah. This is not a simple decision. Of course. Sarah put a hand on Elizabeth's arm for just a moment. Whatever you decide, what was said in this room stays in this room. Elizabeth just nodded, then looked at Matthew. Mr. Hayes, could I have a word with you alone? Sarah took the hint and stepped back into her father's office. Once they were by themselves, Elizabeth moved a little closer to Matthew, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you not tell me your farm was taken by my father's bank? Would it have made a difference? Back in that cabin during the storm, we were just two people. No names, no history. It matters now. Her eyes searched his face. Every little thing matters now. Matthew paused for a second, then just said it plain. Your father took my family's land by cheating us. That is the God's honest truth these papers show. But that does not change what happened between us out there. That was real too. What happened between us? Elizabeth's voice shook a little. I am engaged to Sullivan now. They made the official announcement just last night. I heard. Congratulations. There was no anger in his voice, just a tired acceptance. That is not what I want. The words slipped out of her, quiet, almost like she could not stop them. Then what do you want, Elizabeth? She had to look away. Something impossible. A way to move forward that does not mean I have to betray my father or betray myself. Sometimes there just is not a clean path. Matthew's voice got a little softer. There is just the one that lets you look at yourself in the mirror the next morning. Elizabeth looked back at him, and for a moment something passed between them without a word being spoken. Then she stood up, tall. Her decision was made. I will help you. Not to bring my father down, but to find the truth, whatever that means for all of us. But before Matthew could even answer, the courthouse door flew open with a bang. Judge Davidson rushed in, his face all grim. Elizabeth, you need to get out of here right now. Sullivan and your father are on their way over. She went pale as a ghost. How could they know? Somebody must have seen you come in. News travels mighty fast in Timberline. Elizabeth started for the back exit, but Davidson shook his head. No good. They are already on the steps. Hayes, get her into my chambers. Sarah, you have to stall them. Matthew guided Elizabeth, hurried through the record room and right into Judge Davidson's private office. They'd barely shut the door when angry voices started echoing from the main room. Where is she? Samuel Prescott's demand rang out clear as a bell. Who might that be, Mr. Prescott? Sarah's voice answered, calm and steady as always. My daughter. Someone saw her walk into this very building. Well, lots of folks visit the courthouse, Sarah replied smoothly. Public records are here for every citizen. Don't you play games with me, Miss Davidson. Sullivan's voice cut in, cold as a winter morning. Is Elizabeth here, or isn't she? Through a small crack in the door, Matthew could see Samuel Prescott's face, flushed red with pure fury. Sullivan stood right beside him, his eyes scanning the whole room like a predator on the hunt. Mr. Prescott, Mr. Sullivan. Judge Davidson's powerful voice cut through the tension. This is a place of law. You either act accordingly or you will leave. My daughter has been listening to your meddling, Samuel accused him. First, you offer that clerk job to Hayes, and now you're having secret meetings with Elizabeth. You are trying to undermine my family. Well, if doing business the right way can be undermined by the plain truth, then maybe it deserves a closer look, Davidson replied, his voice even. Sullivan took a step forward. Careful now, Judge. Your position isn't immune to a little political pressure. The governor certainly values his friendship with Prescott Enterprises. Are you threatening an elected official, son? Davidson's voice turned to steel. That would be a mighty foolish thing to do. Right beside Matthew, Elizabeth stood listening, her hand pressed hard against her mouth. The men she had known her whole life, her father and her fiancé, were showing their true colors, full of raw ambition and a willingness to make threats. Search the building, Samuel ordered, clearing his throat. Elizabeth, if you can hear me, show yourself this instant. This childish game of yours ends right now. Davidson stepped forward, blocking the path to his private chambers. You have no authority to search these court offices, Prescott. I strongly suggest you leave before this turns into a serious legal matter. The tense standoff felt like it was balanced on the edge of a knife. Matthew could feel Elizabeth trembling beside him, torn between her desire to hide and the urge to confront her own father. Very well, Samuel's voice dropped, low and dangerous. But you understand this, Davidson. Your little investigation is over, right now. Any other moves against Prescott Enterprises will be met with every bit of our political and financial power. Is that how justice works in your world, Prescott? Davidson challenged. Money decides what's true. Justice serves the folks strong enough to write the rules, Samuel shot back. His footsteps moved toward the exit. When you see my daughter, you tell her she is expected at home. Immediately. The heavy outer door slammed shut. Elizabeth sagged against Matthew. The heavy weight of the confrontation they had just barely avoided was pressing down on her. They know, she whispered. They know I'm trying to help you. We don't know that for sure, Matthew tried to reassure her. It could just be a wild guess. Davidson opened his chamber door. They're gone, but they'll be watching this building like hawks now. Elizabeth can't leave without them seeing her. I have to go home, she said, her voice shaking. I have to face my father. Hiding just makes me look guilty. Not just yet, Davidson advised. Give them some time to cool their heels. Sarah, why don't you take Elizabeth to your place through the back alley? She can rest there while we figure out our next move. Sarah nodded, grabbing her coat. My father's right. We need a moment to think this all through. Elizabeth looked over at Matthew, and he could see the indecision all over her face. This is all happening so fast. The truth has a way of picking up speed once it gets going, Davidson observed. The real question now is, do we steer it, or do we just get swept away by it? As Sarah led Elizabeth out toward the back exit, Matthew felt like the whole world was shifting under his feet. The lines had been drawn in the sand and sides had been chosen. A showdown that had been brewing for years was now heading toward its final chapter. Off in the distance, dark storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, stark against the morning sky. Another big Montana blizzard was on its way, a perfect mirror for the human storm that was building right there in Timberline. Matthew watched Elizabeth disappear down the alley with Sarah, just two small figures against the massive, looming weather. Some storms, you just have to ride them out. Others, you have to face head on. This one, Matthew had a gut feeling, was going to require both courage and a whole lot of faith before it was over. The blizzard hit Timberline just after midnight, roaring down from the mountains like it was Judgment Day itself. Snow piled up in huge drifts against the buildings. The wind howled through the empty streets. And by the time the sun came up, the whole town was buried under 2 feet of fresh powder, with even more still falling. Nature, not caring one bit about human plans, had forced a temporary ceasefire on the conflict that was brewing. Inside the Davidson home, a modest 2-story clapboard house just 3 blocks from the courthouse, Elizabeth Prescott found a moment of peace. Elizabeth stood at the window, just watching the storm roll in. She hadn't slept a wink, couldn't, with the weight of her choice pressing down on her soul like that heavy, wet snow outside. Sarah Davidson came into the small guest room carrying a tray with hot coffee and biscuits. At just 25 years old, Sarah had spent her whole life learning at her father's side. She learned about law and justice from a man who believed in both with all his heart. She set the tray on a small table and joined Elizabeth at the window. Father says this storm might just last for 2 whole days. The roads are already blocked solid. Elizabeth just nodded, taking the warm cup of coffee Sarah offered. My father will be worried sick, and then he will be angry. You could have gone home last night, but what would you have faced? Threats and locked doors, I reckon. Elizabeth took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and strong, honest, not like those fancy coffees her father always had shipped in. No, Elizabeth said softly. I need some time to think this through. Sarah watched her, this woman who seemed like she was from another world entirely, even in a simple borrowed dress because her fancy one was just not practical. You could still see how she carried herself. That straight back and lifted chin that came from a life of privilege. What are you fixing to do, Karen? Sarah asked quietly, when this storm finally breaks. Elizabeth just watched the snowflakes dance and swirl against the window pane. The right thing. I just have to figure out for sure what that is. Is it right to protect a father who's taken so much from other folks? Or is it right to bring him down? Elizabeth's voice was tight. He wasn't always like this. After my mother passed, something inside him just changed. He got harder, like he thought piling up money could fill the hole she left behind. Sarah moved over to poke at the fire, making the embers glow. My own mother died when I was 12 years old. My father lost his arm at Shiloh that very same year. But all that loss didn't turn him mean. I suppose some men just bend under a heavy weight, while others, they just break. Elizabeth turned away from the window, her mind made up. I need to see the evidence. Everything you and your father have gathered against Prescott Enterprises. If I am going to make this choice, I have to understand exactly what my father has done. Sarah paused for a moment. Father keeps all those papers locked up tight in his office safe. Then we need to go speak with him, Elizabeth said, standing a little taller. Her decision was made. I am not going to hide in this room while other people decide my future. I have done that for far too long. Downstairs, Judge Davidson sat at his desk in the small study he kept. At the house, reading over court papers by the light of a lamp. At 65, his face was like a map of the hard road his life had traveled. Deep lines carved by sun, wind, and the war that had taken his arm. He looked up when the women came in, and he set his papers aside. Miss Prescott, I trust you slept all right. Not particularly, Judge, she answered. Elizabeth took the chair right across from his desk. I need to know everything you found out about my father's business dealings, every last bit of it. Judge Davidson just studied her for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. Oh, then, why is that? Because I have to be absolutely certain before I do anything. Certain of what? That you're seeking justice, Judge, and not just revenge. Elizabeth met his gaze, head on. That the proof you have is worth all the pain that bringing it to light is going to cause. The judge's weathered face gave nothing away. And what if I say no? Then I will go back home. When this storm is over and marry James Sullivan, just like it was planned. Because if I am not certain, then my loyalty has to be to my father. The challenge just hung there in the quiet room, between the two of them. Judge Davidson glanced over at his daughter, and Sarah gave him the slightest nod. Then he stood up, walked over to a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the wall, and swung it to the side, revealing a small safe set right into the wall. He turned the dial, opened it, and pulled out a thick leather folder, placing it on the desk. This is everything we have gathered over the past year, he said, pushing it toward Elizabeth. Court records, bank papers, statements from witnesses, the whole ugly pattern of his deceit and strong-arming. Elizabeth opened the folder with hands that did not shake. Inside was the story of how her father's empire was built, one crooked deal at a time, all written down, on paper. For the next 3 hours, she read every single page, asking a question here and there and making a few notes. The judge and Sarah stayed with her, answering. When she asked, but mostly they just sat in silence. Outside, the blizzard raged on. The snow piled up higher and the wind rattled the windows. But inside that room, a different kind of storm was brewing as Elizabeth took in the sheer size of what her father had done. At long last, she closed the folder. Her face was pale as a ghost, but her eyes were steady and clear. 23 families, she said, her voice barely a whisper. 23 farms and ranches, all taken with doctored papers, false records, and debts that were just made up. Yes, Judge Davidson's voice was gentle. It all looked legal on paper, but every bit of it was a lie in truth. And my future husband, Elizabeth's voice held no surprise, only a cold, hard certainty. He planned most of it. Sullivan was the one who drew up the plans, the judge confirmed. Your father just provided the money and the muscle. Elizabeth stood up and walked back to the window. Through a break in the swirling snow, she could just barely see distant shape of the Prescott mansion on the hill, its lights glowing against the storm. So what happens now? She asked quietly. If all these papers get out, it means criminal charges for Sullivan. Now your father would likely stay out of prison with his connections, but the civil lawsuits would take most of his fortune, Davidson said, stating it as a simple fact. Prescott Enterprises would be wiped out. Elizabeth took that in. And Matthew Hayes, what's in it for him? Justice, I suppose, and maybe some money for the land he lost. But nothing can give him back the years that were stolen, or his folks he had to bury after they lost it all. Elizabeth turned back to the window. I will help you, but I need one thing from you. Name it. A chance to face my father alone before this all goes public. Just one chance to make him see the mess he has made, and maybe offer him a way to start making it right. Davidson thought about it for a moment. That could be risky. Sullivan will not hesitate to get rid of any proof if he gets a warning. I will not warn them. I will just talk to my father by myself. Elizabeth's voice was firm now. I owe him that. Not for his sake, but for the man he used to be before all this greed took him over. All right then, Davidson nodded. When the storm lets up, you will have your chance. But we will need some backup in place. What kind of backup? Matthew Hayes will go with you to the Prescott estate. He will wait outside, but if you are not out within an hour, or if you give a signal that you are in trouble, he is going in. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. You trust him that much? I do. Davidson's voice was solid as oak. Hayes is a man who stands by his word. That is rare these days and precious. A sharp knock on the front door cut through the quiet. Sarah went to answer it, coming back a moment later with Matthew Hayes. Snow dusted his hat and coat, and he favored his right leg as he stomped his boots on the mat inside the door. The biting cold had stirred up that old wound from the war. Judge, Matthew nodded with respect. Miss Prescott. Hayes, Davidson motioned for him to come closer. Did not figure I would see anyone out and about in this blizzard. I came from the courthouse, had some papers I needed to finish up. Matthew's eyes then found Elizabeth's, and she saw the concern in them. Folks in town are talking. Seems Prescott's men are asking around, trying to find out where Miss Prescott is. Let them ask, Davidson said calmly. This storm will keep them busy for a little while. Elizabeth watched Matthew. The snow melting off his coat made a small puddle on the floor. His face looked tired, but his eyes were full of resolve. She found herself wondering how far he had walked in that storm, and what his real reason for coming was. Mr. Hayes, she said, would you walk me to the kitchen? I reckon we could all do with a fresh pot of coffee. In the kitchen, Elizabeth kept her hands busy with the stove and the coffee pot, feeling Matthew standing by the door. When the water started to hiss, she finally turned to look at him. You did not come here because of some unfinished papers. Matthew took off his hat, turning it over in his hands. No, ma'am. You came to make sure I was all right. It just seemed wise. Sullivan is not the kind of man who takes being told no very well. Elizabeth let a small smile show. I do not need protecting, Mr. Hayes. I have been dealing with difficult men for my entire life. I never said you did. He met her eyes directly, but having a friend in a fight makes any battle easier. The simple truth of his words hung in the air between them. Elizabeth felt something change, like a line being erased. In a different world, at a different time, this man could have meant something very different to her. I have decided to help Judge Davidson, she said. I am going to give him the evidence against my father and James Sullivan. Matthew just nodded as if he already knew. I imagine that was not an easy choice. It was not. It still is not. She turned back to the stove as the water came to a boil. But some debts have to be paid, even if you are not the one who made them. Your father's debts are not yours to carry, are they? Elizabeth scooped coffee into the pot. I have lived a comfortable life while families like yours lost everything. I had privileges that were bought with other people's pain. You did not know. Or maybe I did not want to know. She poured the hot water and the rich smell of coffee filled the room. Choosing to be blind does not make you innocent, Mr. Hayes. They stood there in silence while the coffee brewed. Outside, the wind howled and shook the windows. But inside, in that warm kitchen, a quiet understanding was growing between them, as delicate as a new spring leaf. After all this is done, Matthew finally said, what will you do? Elizabeth had not even thought about it. Her whole future had always been a straight line, drawn by her father's plans and what society expected of her. The freedom to just choose was a place she had never been. I do not know, she said honestly. Everything I have ever known is about to be gone. My father brought shame on us, dragged our family name through the mud, and ruined our standing in this town. But not everything worthwhile comes with a fancy pedigree. Matthew's voice stayed real gentle. Some things just grow better in humble soil. Elizabeth looked up and found him watching her with eyes that had seen too much heartache to judge anyone harshly. She realized he was not just talking about her situation, but offering something much deeper. Understanding, forgiveness, maybe even a future, though neither of them could put a name to it just yet. The coffee is ready, she said, breaking the quiet moment. We ought to join the others. They went back to the study where Judge Davidson was showing his daughter another paper from the portfolio. The judge looked on up as they came in, accepting the coffee Elizabeth offered him. Hayes, we have made our decision. As soon as this storm breaks, Miss Prescott will go home to face her father in private. She is going to try and convince him to make things right before we have to take legal action. Matthew frowned. Alone? That is not safe, not completely alone. You will go with her to the estate, but you will stay outside and step in only if it is necessary. Matthew's eyes moved to Elizabeth. Are you certain about this? I am. My father deserves one chance to make this right. And if he refuses, well, then justice will have its day. Her voice was steady as a rock now. But first, I need to look him square in the eye and ask him why. Why he betrayed every single thing my mother valued. Why he became the kind of man he used to look down on. Matthew nodded real slow. I will be there, whatever you need. The day just crawled by slowly, with the storm showing no sign of quitting. Elizabeth helped Sarah fix a simple supper, and the two women found some surprising common ground, despite their different upbringings. Judge Davidson went over court documents, getting the legal case ready that was fixing to shake the Montana territory right down to its foundations. Matthew fixed a loose shutter that had been banging around in the wind, his practical nature always looking for a problem to solve. By that evening, the house had become a safe haven with a shared purpose. The four of them, an unlikely group, bound together by a commitment to justice and truth. After supper, as Davidson and Sarah talked over legal strategies, Elizabeth found Matthew in the small back parlor, just staring into the fireplace. She sat down beside him, watching the flames leap and dance. Judge Davidson reckons the storm might break before morning, she said. Matthew nodded. The weather changes on a dime in these mountains. You can get clear skies just hours after the worst blizzards. Are you scared? She asked him all of a sudden. Of what is coming? He thought on it for a moment. Not scared, no. Concerned. Your father and Sullivan have a lot of power and connections. They are not going to give up easily. They have never gone up against someone with nothing left to lose. Elizabeth's voice had a new kind of steel in it. That is their weakness. They believe every person has a price, some soft spot that can be used against them. Everybody does. Matthew looked right at her. Even me, even you. So what is yours, Mr. Bays? His gaze went back to the fire. Lost it already. You cannot lose the same thing 2 times. Your family's land. No, though that one cut deep enough. He fell silent, and Elizabeth understood he was not going to say any more. Some wounds just stay too private to share, even in moments of unexpected closeness. I should get some rest, she said finally. Tomorrow is going to demand all the strength we have. Matthew nodded. Good night, Miss Prescott. Elizabeth, she corrected him. After all this, I reckon we have earned the right to use our first names. A little hint of a smile crossed his face. Good night, Elizabeth. Good night, Matthew. She climbed the stairs to the guest room, knowing that tomorrow would close one chapter of her life and open up a whole new one, with pages that were not yet written. Clear's throat. The storm finally broke before dawn, the clouds parting to show stars as bright as diamonds in that big black Montana sky. By sunrise, the whole world sparkled under a fresh blanket of snow, all pristine and new. Timberline looked like a town from a storybook, with buildings all capped in white and smoke rising straight up from the chimneys in the still cold air. Elizabeth got dressed in her borrowed clothes, which were simple and practical, not like her usual fine things. Sarah had offered her a heavy wool coat, an essential protection against that bitter cold. As she was fastening the buttons, Elizabeth caught her own reflection in the small mirror. She looked different, stronger. The woman staring back at her was no longer just Samuel Prescott's daughter, but someone who was forging her own path through hard choices. Downstairs, Judge Davidson, Sarah, and Matthew were waiting in the kitchen. They had been talking over their strategy, but they fell silent as Elizabeth entered. The judge gave her a nod of approval, her practical and determined look. The roads are getting cleared, he said. By noon, travel ought to be possible again. I need to leave sooner, Elizabeth replied. On horseback, before my father sends his men out looking for me. I've already saddled 2 horses, Matthew confirmed. They can manage the snow if Ben... We're careful. Judge Davison handed Elizabeth a small Derringer pistol. You take this, just in case. She hesitated for a second, then took the weapon, tucking it deep into her coat pocket. I won't be needing it. My father would never harm me, whatever his other faults might be. Sullivan might not feel the same way, the judge warned her. You stay vigilant. They made their final preparations in a hurry. Matthew would ride with Elizabeth to the Prescott estate, staying hidden but close by. If she did not come out within 1 hour, or if she signaled for help by drawing the curtains in her father's study, he was going in. Meanwhile, Judge Davidson would get all the legal papers ready to move against Prescott Enterprises, filing them only after Elizabeth had her talk with her father. They slipped out through the back door, with Matthew leading 2 horses through the snow-filled streets. Not many people were out yet. Most were still digging out from the big storm. They reached the edge of town without any trouble. Then they mounted up and rode toward the Prescott estate on the hill that overlooked Timberline. The journey took a lot longer than usual, with the horses struggling through knee-deep snow. Elizabeth rode a little bit ahead, rehearsing in her mind what she was going to say to her father. Not accusations, but questions. Not judgment, but an appeal to the kind of man he used to be. They stopped at the line of trees bordering the Prescott property. The mansion stood 200 yards away, its windows glowing with the early morning light. Matthew swung down from his horse and helped Elizabeth down. 1 hour, he reminded her. If you are not out by then, I am coming in. Elizabeth nodded, suddenly realizing this might be the very last time she would see her childhood home with the same eyes. After today, everything was going to change. Thank you, she said, not just for this, but for showing me what real integrity looks like. Matthew looked a bit uncomfortable with the praise. Just doing what needs doing. Few men can claim that much, Elizabeth said, and she touched his arm. Whatever happens, I will not regret this choice. She turned and walked through the snow toward the mansion, her back straight and her head held high. Matthew watched until she reached the front door, then led the horses deeper into the trees to wait and to watch. Elizabeth let herself into her home using her own key and was surprised to find no servants anywhere in the main hall. Usually by this hour, the whole house would be bustling with activity. She took off her borrowed coat, hung it in the entryway, then made her way to her father's study. The door was closed, but a sliver of light showed underneath it. She knocked firmly. Enter. It was Samuel Prescott's voice, tired but still commanding. Elizabeth opened the door to find her father at his desk, still wearing the clothes from the day before, clearly having worked all through the night. Papers were scattered across the normally perfect surface. He looked up, his surprise turning to relief and then hardening into anger. Elizabeth, he said as he stood up, 2 days and not one word. Do you have any idea the worry you have caused? I needed time to think, she replied calmly. The storm gave me that. Think about what? Running away from your responsibilities? Embarrassing this family in front of the entire territory? His voice rose. Where have you been? That does not matter now. Elizabeth closed the door behind her. We need to talk, Father. About the Montana Territorial Bank, about foreclosures, and about James Sullivan. Samuel went completely still. What kind of nonsense has Davidson been filling your head with? Not nonsense, evidence. Elizabeth moved to the chair across from his desk, but she remained standing. 23 properties taken through fraud, with altered loan documents and falsified payment records, with your signature authorizing it all. Those are business practices you could not possibly understand. Samuel's face flushed with color. The bank was simply protecting its interest against unreliable borrowers. Borrowers like the Hayes family, who made every single payment on time only to have their record changed after the fact. Samuel's eyes narrowed. So that is it. You have developed some little romantic notion about that ranch hand, and now you are throwing away your future based on his sob story. This is not about Matthew Hayes. This is about you. Elizabeth's voice remained steady. The man who raised me to believe in honesty and fairness. The man who once told me that character matters more than profit. What happened to him, Father? He grew up. He realized the world. The ward's strength, not a soft heart. Samuel walked over to the window, gazing out at his snow-covered land. Everything I've built, I did it for you, a legacy that was meant to set you up for life. And this is the thanks I get, running around with my enemies. They're only your enemies because you made them that way. Elizabeth came to stand beside him at the window. Judge Davidson has enough evidence to press criminal charges against Sullivan and file civil suits against you, but I talked him into giving me this one chance to talk with you in private first. Samuel turned around, pure shock on his face. Why in the world would you do that? Because I remember the father you were before Mama passed, the man who taught me how to ride a horse, who read me stories every single night, who believed in more than just account books and profit margins. Elizabeth's voice got a little softer. That man deserves one chance to make this right. Make what right? Business is business. Theft is theft, whether it's done with a gun or with a pen. Elizabeth looked him straight in the eye. You have a choice, Father. Make things right with the families you've hurt, or face public shame and lose every penny when Davidson files that case. Samuel just stared at her, seeing for the first time not his little girl, but a woman with real principles and courage. For just a second, a flicker of recognition crossed his eyes, like he saw his late wife in Elizabeth's determination. You would bring ruin to your own family name? Everything I've worked for? Samuel's gaze drifted to Sarah's portrait hanging on the wall. For a moment, it was like he saw her not as just paint on a canvas, but as she really was, full of life, principled, and absolutely certain that money meant nothing without honor. Your mother told me something once that I've spent 20 years trying to forget, he said in a low voice. She said a man who trades his honor for safety ends up with neither one. He reached out and touched the frame of the portrait. I thought I was building a legacy for you. Instead, I've been tearing down everything she believed in. To save what's left of your honor? Yes, Elizabeth took his hand. It is not too late. Give back the properties. Pay the money you owe. You'll still be a rich man, just not filthy rich. Samuel pulled his hand away and walked back to his desk. And Sullivan? What about your engagement? There is no engagement. Not anymore. Elizabeth touched the spot on her finger where the diamond ring used to be just last night. I will not marry a man who builds his fortune on the misery of other folks. Samuel sank down heavily into his chair, the weight of it all finally breaking through his pride. For a few long minutes, he didn't say a word, just stared at the papers on his desk. When he finally looked up, it looked like 10 years had been added to his face. Sarah would be so ashamed of the man I've become, he said at last, talking about his late wife. She always saw the good in people. I only see what I can use. It's not too late to change that, Elizabeth urged him. Make it right. Start over. But before Samuel could answer, the door swung open. James Sullivan walked right in without knocking. His suit was perfect. His face was a calm mask, but his eyes were burning with a rage he could barely hold back. Elizabeth, Well, how convenient to find you here. His voice was full of fake warmth. Your father and I have been mighty concerned about you. Elizabeth turned to face him, keeping the desk between the two of them. Mr. Sullivan, I was just explaining to my father that our engagement is over. Sullivan's smile didn't move an inch, though his eyes got even harder. A decision made in a moment of confusion, I'm sure. After we have a little private chat, I am certain you will change your mind. There is nothing to discuss, Elizabeth shot back. I have made my choice. Sullivan turned his gaze to Samuel. Perhaps you should remind your daughter of her duties, Samuel. To her family, to what's proper, to a contract that was signed. Samuel Prescott got to his feet slowly, and you could see something change in the way he held himself. For 20 years he had let grief make him hard, and ambition to blind him, but now, seeing his daughter's courage, something that had been asleep for a long time woke up. My daughter makes her own choices, James. His voice had a new kind of strength. And so do I. Sullivan's calm mask finally started to crack. What were you trying to say? I'm saying our business deal needs a second look. Immediately. Samuel stood up to his full height. Elizabeth has brought some irregularities to my attention, banking practices that I seem to have approved but never really looked at closely. Sullivan's face grew dark. The banking is my business. You have always trusted my judgment on these things. A trust that I'm beginning to think was a mistake. Samuel's voice turned to steel. Were those loan papers changed on your orders, James? Were good folks' payments ignored to help with foreclosures? That is just plain crazy talk. Sullivan looked from the father to his daughter. She has been listening to Davidson and that cowboy, filling her head with lies. Court records do not lie, Elizabeth cut in, and neither do the 23 families who lost everything while Prescott Enterprises got fat on their bad luck. Sullivan's calm finally shattered. He slammed his fist down on the desk. Those people were weak, and they did not deserve it. We built something to last from land they would have just wasted. The pure greed in his voice hung in the air, so honest it was damning. Samuel stepped back like he had been slapped, seeing his partner for who he truly was for the first time. My lord, he whispered, what have we done? Sullivan pulled himself together fast, straightening his jacket. We did what successful men have always done. We seized an opportunity where other men failed. He turned to Elizabeth. This fairy tale idea of justice is charming, but it is not practical. The papers for our marriage are already drawn up. The governor himself saw our engagement. You will honor that commitment. Or what? Elizabeth challenged him. Or your father faces complete ruin. Sullivan's voice dropped to a dangerous low. I have documents with his signature approving every single transaction. If I go down, he is going down with me. Samuel moved to stand by his daughter's side. Then I will go down, but not before I make right what I can. Sullivan stared at them both. Then he laughed, a cold sound with no humor in it. How sweet. Father and daughter united in doing the right thing, even if it leaves them poor. He walked toward the door. You have until noon to change your mind, Elizabeth. After that, I am filing the papers to dissolve Prescott Enterprises, naming your father as the main person in all the questionable deals. He left, the door clicking shut softly behind him. It was more threatening than if he had slammed it. Elizabeth turned to her father. He will destroy the evidence and try to push all the blame onto you. Let him try. Samuel went to a safe, spinning the combination dial. I have kept my own records. A little insurance is what I called it. Protection against a rainy day. He took out a thick folder and handed it to Elizabeth. Every transaction, every property, Sullivan's own instructions in his own handwriting, my authorizations, the dates, the amounts, the changes, everything. Everything Davidson would need to build a solid case. Elizabeth stared at the folder, then she looked at her father. You knew this whole time? I suspected, but I chose not to prove it. Samuel's face was filled with real regret. After your mother died, nothing seemed to matter much, except building something that would last, something that could not be taken away from me like she was. Sullivan offered me a way to get that security, and I took it without looking too closely at the cost. And now we have to face that cost together. He squared his shoulders. Take this to Davidson. Tell him I am prepared to testify against Sullivan and pay back every cent to all the families he hurt. There is something else, Samuel said, opening a drawer and taking out a small journal. For the past year, I have been writing down all of Sullivan's dirty dealings, things that bothered my conscience, but that I excused in the name of business. He handed it to her. Maybe I was just waiting for someone to make me face the man I had become. Elizabeth felt tears welling up, a surprising rush of emotion. It was not exactly joy, but a sense of things being made right. The father she remembered was still there, underneath that hard shell. It will not be easy, she warned him. Your reputation, your place in this town, are worth nothing, just chains, compared to getting my self-respect back. Samuel took her hand. Your mother would be proud of you today. I am too, even though I do not have any right to be. A flash of movement outside the window caught Elizabeth's eye. Matthew Hayes stood at the edge of the woods, watching the house. His hour was nearly up, and he was ready to step in if she needed him. She moved to the window and gave him a small wave to show she was safe. He nodded once, and she could see the relief on his face even from that distance. Is that your cowboy? Samuel asked, following her gaze. He is not mine, Elizabeth replied, but he is a good man who deserves justice. Samuel nodded slowly. Then let us make sure he gets it. Him and all the others. They left the study together, Samuel Prescott carrying the evidence of his own bad deeds, ready at last to face the consequences. Outside, the winter sun sparkled on the fresh snow, looking bright and clean. It was a new day, in more ways than one. That evening, after meeting with Judge Davidson, Samuel returned to his study all alone. The room that had seen so many business victories now just felt empty. He carefully removed his gold cufflinks and his expensive watch, setting them on the desk, symbols of a success that had become. He poured a small measure of brandy into a glass, then stopped, setting it down without taking a sip. For the first time in many years, he wanted a clear head, not comfort. Out the window, he could see the lights of town, the homes of good people he had wronged. Tomorrow was going to bring shame, losing every dime, the end of everything he had ever built. And yet, as he stood there, Samuel felt something he never expected. It was not peace exactly, but it was like a heavy weight was gone, like a man who had carried a heavy pack for so long he forgot how to stand up straight without it. Well, Sarah, he whispered into the quiet room, it seems our daughter takes after your side of the family after all, and thank the good Lord for that. Spring took its sweet time coming to Montana territory that year. April still had patches of snow hiding in the shadows, though little green shoots were pushing up through the soft ground, stubborn and full of life. And in Timberline, change had rolled in just as powerful as the seasons. James Sullivan was facing a trial for a whole list of charges, from fraud to messing with evidence. His plan to skip town was stopped dead in his tracks by Judge Davidson's quick thinking, freezing all his money and putting out warrants before Sullivan could even get to the railroad. Now he was just waiting to be sentenced, his empire in ruins, his name nothing more than a dirty word. Samuel Prescott had managed to avoid jail time by promising to cooperate fully and pay everyone back. The big Prescott mansion had been sold off to cover the money owed to the families hurt by the bank's dirty dealings. Samuel himself had moved into a humble house in town, working to rebuild his character, not his fortune. A week or so after Sullivan's trial, Samuel ran into Matthew outside the courthouse. The two men just stood there for a moment, the air thick with all the history between them. Mr. Hayes, Samuel said with a nod. His whole demeanor changed from that proud banker he used to be. I hear you've gotten your family's land back. Yes, sir, I have, Matthew answered, plain and simple. Samuel paused for a second, then held out his hand. No apology in the world can give you back the years that were taken. But I need you to know that of all the wrong I've done, what happened to your family is what weighs on me the most. Matthew looked at the hand for a long moment, then he took it, just for a second. It might not have been forgiveness, but it was an understanding. A man ain't just judged by his mistakes, he said softly, but by how he goes about making them right. Samuel nodded, understanding the quiet grace he was being offered. Elizabeth speaks real highly of your plans for that farm. Simple plans, honest work. That's the best kind, Samuel replied, and he truly meant it. Judge Wilson had weathered the storm in his own way, too. Sullivan's scheme to get his ranch was brought to light before any papers were ever signed. With Judge Davidson's help, Wilson had drawn up a solid agreement that protected his water rights and property lines for good. He had decided to stay in timberline after all, finding a new sense of purpose in helping out the younger ranchers. He'd even offered Matthew some work here and there, though he knew Hayes was focused on rebuilding his own family's legacy. Nowadays, the old judge was a regular at Davidson's playing chess. The two old soldiers were finding they had plenty to talk about, even if they'd fought on different sides of the war. On a bright morning in April, Matthew Hayes stood on a piece of land that felt like home. His land, given back to him as part of the settlement. 20 acres his granddaddy had cleared. The little farmhouse his father had built with his own hands. Now his again, by law and by right. The buildings needed a lot of work after 5 years of neglect, but the soil was still rich, the water ran clear, and you could just feel the promise in the air. He knelt down, scooping up a handful of dirt, letting it run right through his fingers. This was land that knew his family's sweat and tears, land that held his parents' graves on the little hill just behind the house. Land he thought he had lost forever and a day. The sound of horse hooves coming near made him stand up, brushing the dirt from his hands. Elizabeth Prescott was riding towards him, wearing a simple riding skirt and jacket, looking practical. She had changed over the last few months, letting go of the fancy life of the wealthy for something simpler, though she still carried herself with a natural grace. She swung down from her horse, tying the reins to the broken fence that marked the edge of his property. "It sure looks different in the springtime," she said, looking around. "It looks hopeful," Matthew nodded. "It's good soil. With a little hard work, it'll be producing again by the fall." "Judge Davidson approved the last of the restitution payments yesterday," Elizabeth told him. "All 23 families have gotten what was owed to them, with interest. Your father kept his word. He surely did." A touch of pride was in her form. It hasn't been easy on him. Starting all over at 60, seeing old friends turn their backs on him. But I've started seeing glimpses of the man he was before all this. I remembered. They walked on together toward that old farmhouse, its weathered boards still solid after all those empty years. Matthew had already started fixing it up. He was already replacing broken windows and mending that porch step. "Are you going to rebuild here?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, ma'am. Something simple at first, just what I need to get through the winter." Matthew looked over the property, seeing not what it was, but what it could be. "Next spring, I'll add on to it, maybe plant some apple trees along the south field. Apple trees take years to bear fruit. Some things are just worth waiting for." He looked right at her then, real direct, with no pretense. "How about you? Still working at the school?" Elizabeth nodded. 3 days a week, teaching reading and arithmetic. The rest of my time, I'm helping Sarah Davidson with court paperwork. The judge says I have a real talent for keeping things organized." They had reached the porch. Matthew motioned to the steps and they sat down side by side, looking out over the land that stretched out before them, all green and full of promise. "Town's still talking," he said after a bit. "About you, about the choices you've made." "Let them talk." Elizabeth's voice didn't have a lick of regret in it. "I've heard enough whispers to last a lifetime. They matter less each day." Matthew studied the side of her face, the determined set of her chin, the clear eyes that saw the world for what it was, yet still worked toward what it could be. In the months since that Sullivan trial, he had gotten to know her beyond the dramatic way they first met. Her strength, her quiet humor, her willingness to start over with no hard feelings. "I'm heading to Helena next week," he said. "I need some supplies that Weber can't get for me. Seed, tools, lumber for the repairs. It is a long journey to make alone. I thought maybe you might want to come along." The invitation came out a little rough, kinda uncertain. "If you don't have other plans, that is." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised. "To Helena. In a town that size, people don't know your history. They don't care about family names or fortunes lost." Matthew focused on the distant mountains. Just two people traveling together, nothing more complicated than that. The offer just hung there in the air between them. It was not quite a declaration, but it was a beginning. A door opened that both of them could choose to walk through. Elizabeth smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I would like that very much." They sat in a comfortable silence as the spring breeze drifted across the land, carrying the scent of new growth and possibility. Behind them stood a house just waiting to become a home again. Before them stretched fields ready for planting, and between them, something fragile and strong was taking root, like the first shoots of wheat pushing through that Montana soil after the long winter's sleep. Some legacies were written down in bank books and property deeds. Others were written in the quiet choices made when your principles meet opportunity. But the most lasting ones were written on the heart, passed from one generation to the next by example instead of inheritance. As the afternoon sun warmed that old porch, Elizabeth reached out, briefly touching Matthew's hand. He turned his palm upward, and their fingers interlocked without any fuss or declaration. A simple connection, as honest as the land right beneath their feet. In the distance, the mountains stood as silent witnesses, unchanged by human plans or the turning of the seasons. They had seen empires rise and fall, fortunes made and lost, and love found in the most unlikely circumstances. They would see it all again countless times over countless years, but maybe never with quite the same quiet dignity as the woman who had given up wealth for her principles, and the man who had refused to surrender his principles, even when everything else was lost. Some storms come on suddenly, changing the whole landscape overnight. Others work slowly, wearing away the false foundations until only the truth is left standing. Both were necessary in their own time, in their own season. The distant church bell in Timberline rang 4 times, marking the hour. Matthew and Elizabeth stayed right there on the porch of the farmhouse that was once lost and was now found. 2 figures against the vast Montana sky, planning not an empire but a life, simple and honest, theirs.